Thank you so much for checking out LearnLinuxTV, your source for Linux-related fun and learning. I just love making this content for you guys, but making such content isn't cheap. If you enjoy my content, please consider supporting me by becoming a patron. As a patron, you'll enjoy ad-free versions of every video that I upload, and also, at specific tiers, you'll also enjoy early access to select videos before the rest of the world. But even if you're not able to support me by becoming a patron, no problem. There's other ways to help. You can simply click the like button on the videos that you enjoy. That would help out. In addition to that, word of mouth helps as well. So if you are enjoying my content, please help spread the learning by telling your friends and coworkers about the channel. If you're looking for something to read, well, you're in luck. I write books. And you can check out my latest books at LearnLinux.tv/books. Are you looking for help for your Linux server related projects? Or are you a business that has a Linux related project that you're working on and you need another set of hands? Well, you're in luck. Go to LearnLinux.tv/request-assistance. There you can check out my schedule and consider hiring me to help you out. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with today's video. Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to my Proxmox course yet again. In today's episode, we're going to talk about users. It's like the subject that all administrators have to talk about, every now and then, because users are great, and then, sometimes not so great. We have to keep our eye on them, but we're not going to get into that part of things, but we are going to talk about users in Proxmox to help you understand the two different types of users that exist in Proxmox, when to choose one versus the other, and how to manage them. So let's get started. All right, so let's talk about users. If I click here on Data Center to go to the Data Center view, we have a Users section right here. We have one user currently named root, and this is actually the root user that's on the underlying host system for PVE1. Now, before we get into what that actually means, one thing to understand is that there's actually two realms when it comes to users. And you can see the realm listed right here for the user root. It's listed under PAM. And what PAM actually refers to is the user management on the underlying host system itself. PAM is just Linux authentication, essentially. Now, the difference between PAM users and Proxmox users is going to become more apparent as we go along with the video, so don't worry about it so much right now. I'm going to walk you through the process of creating a PAM user, and I'll also walk you through the process of creating a Proxmox user. Now, both PAM and Proxmox users are able to use Proxmox. The difference is mainly where the user is actually created and where the information for that user is stored. But anyway, let's walk through the process. So we have the user root right here, and let's just assume that we have another person, I'll use myself as an example, that wants to manage this particular data center. So what I'm going to do is add a user. And right here, I'm going to add my username. I'll just use my first name to keep it simple. Now, we could select a group, but I don't have any groups just yet. We'll get to that. Anyway, I could create an expiration date for the user. I could enable or disable the user. And I could also add the first name, last name, and email address if I wanted to. And I could also add a comment if I found that helpful, to let me know why that user exists on the system and what they're there to do. I'll leave that up to you when it comes to how to fill this out. I'm just keeping it simple by using my first name, and for the realm, I'm selecting Linux PAM standard authentication for this particular user. So what I'll do is add the user, and now the user is added. Now, there's actually going to be some confusion when it comes to this particular user that I created right here. So, for example, what I'm going to do is click on PVE1, and then I'll click on Shell to access a Shell console here, and I'm automatically logged in as root, as we see here. Now, if you're at all familiar with Linux authentication, then you know that the etc password file is where Linux systems store their user accounts. Now, as you can see, my user is not listed here. Since I created a normal user account, it should have had the ID of 1000. And by ID, I'm talking about the user ID. This has nothing to do with Proxmox. Linux systems have user IDs or UIDs for all the users that exist on the system. If I create a user on the Linux system itself, it's assigned a UID, the next available UID. And as you can see here, I don't have my name anywhere. It would have been added to the end of the file if it did add it. So what we can glean from this is that even though I added the user to the GUI here in Proxmox, it didn't actually create the user on the underlying system. Now that might seem like a very annoying thing, and I'll admit that it's not the most convenient thing, but it does make sense, and it will make sense more here in a moment. But basically what I'm going to do is set a password for that user. It didn't even ask me to set a password for that user. So I'll use passwd and then my name. This is just a standard Linux command. I have an entire Linux Essentials series that goes over this command as well as others. Definitely check out that series if you want to learn more about Linux. But anyway, I'll press enter. And it tells me that the user J does not exist. So if I was to log out, what I could do is type my username and my password here, but I can't type my password because my user doesn't have a password. So I'm not going to be able to do this, just type in my name and then click login because you need to have a password, and also the user does need to exist. So essentially when I added the user to the GUI, all it really did was just add it to the GUI, but you have to go through another step and add it to the system. Now what I'll do is just log in as root. And now I'm logged back into the server. So what I'm going to do is fix this right now and create the user here on the Proxmox server. I'm on PVE1 and I'm going to create the user right now. So what I'm going to do is type add user and then the username that I want to create, in this case J. I'll press enter. And I'll type in a password for that user. And I'll type it in again. And I'm just going to skip these prompts. You could fill these out if you want to, but it doesn't really matter to me. So I'm just going to press enter through all of these. And then is this information correct? Y is capital, which means it's the default option. I'll press enter. And now that user is created. And to prove that, we can see it there at the end. It's the second to last line. It shows my user right there with a UID of 1000 and a group ID of 1000. Again, I have dedicated videos that explain that in more detail. I have a video about adding users to a Linux system and also a video for adding groups to a Linux system. Anyway, now that I did add that user, let's go ahead and log out. And I'll log in as the user that I just created. Let's see what happens. And now I'm in. Now notice though that I do have the server PVE1. I'm not able to see what's underneath it. And in addition to that, I really don't have access to all that much at all. So what we can see here is that my user, well, it doesn't have permission to anything. So that's why I don't see anything underneath this. So what I'm going to do is just log back into the server again as root. And let's explore this a little bit deeper to fully understand what's going on with users. So I have this user highlighted right here. This is the user that I tried to log in as. Well, I did log in as this user, but I didn't have access to anything. I couldn't see VMs or even the stats of the server. It was completely useless. Now notice that it's in the PAM realm. So what I'm going to do is add the user again, and I'll create it with the same name. But what I'm going to do instead is actually add it to the Proxmox authentication server instead of PAM. So I'll type in the password here for this user. Notice that it's actually asking me for the password this time. And then here we can select a group, but I haven't created any groups, so that's okay. We can do that later. But I'm adding the user to the Proxmox authentication server like I mentioned. I'm going to leave most of this blank. I'll just click add. And now we have the same user twice. But one of them is in the PAM realm and the other is in the PVE realm. Now what I'm going to do is log out. I don't suspect that there's going to be any difference as far as permissions are concerned. But what I want to show you is that when you go to log into the server, you can of course choose the realm that you want to log into. So I was using PAM before. I want to make sure that I'm choosing this option here, the Proxmox VE authentication server. and then I'll click Login. Now for this user, the access here is virtually the same, meaning that this user in particular is completely useless. It can't do anything. But we have the user created in both realms, and the reason why I did that is because I wanted to show you that you can have the same user twice. So I'll log back in as root, I'll type in the password, I'll make sure that it says Pam right here, which it does, and now I'm logged into the server. So we have these two users right here that I created, and they're both equally useless. And the concept of user management seems to be at least a little confusing when it comes to new users of Proxmox. But let's break down why we have two different user accounts right here. So let's start with this one. This is actually the second user that I created, and I created it in the PVE realm. And what that means is that this user exists in Proxmox, but it does not exist on a system. So for example, if I add yet another user, and I'll add Spock to the system, he's pretty cool, and I'm going to create him in the Proxmox VE authentication server. I'll type a password for him, and then I'll add him. And here he is. Now if I go here to my Proxmox server, and then click on Shell, if you recall earlier, I mentioned that the etc password file is where the user accounts are actually stored. Let's check that out. And here's my user. That's the Pam user that I created earlier for myself. But notice that Spock is not listed here at all. So what you can glean from that is when you add a Proxmox user, that user is not actually a system user. It's not a Linux system user. It doesn't exist in the Linux system normally. And Proxmox users are generally used to manage the Proxmox system itself. So if you wanted to invite a coworker, for example, to log into the server and help create some VMs for you, maybe manage the VMs, things like that, then you'll generally want to create users like that in the Proxmox authentication server. And for the majority of your needs, that's more than sufficient. So if that's really all you need, then why would you even want to create a PAM user? The thing is, PAM users, they can use SSH to log into the server. So by me creating J in the PAM realm, that means that that particular user is able to log into the server via SSH and manage it via the command line. A Proxmox user is not able to do that. Now sure, a Proxmox user can click on Shell, like I've done numerous times so far, and manage it via the command line that way, but they wouldn't be able to log into the actual system via SSH unless they had a PAM account. In fact, you don't even have to add a PAM user here to Proxmox at all. You can just add it to the underlying Linux server, the underlying Proxmox server, and that's fine. So the main takeaway so far is that if you want to create a user to access the server via SSH, then you want to do so with PAM. And it's a good idea to add that PAM user here to the Proxmox GUI. Now, if you want to allow someone to manage VMs via the GUI, the web console here, then you want to create that user in the PVE realm, like this one. So this user here exists on the Proxmox server, but it doesn't exist on the underlying Linux server itself. But now you know the difference. But the thing is though, regardless of which of these two users I logged into the server with, neither of them are able to do anything. So what we want to do right now is actually try to fix that. Now what I want to do, first and foremost, is add a new group. And what I'm going to do is create that group right here. And just to keep it simple, what I'm going to do is call the group admins. Now notice that there's no configuration here whatsoever, other than the fact that I could type a comment. But what I'm doing is creating a group, and that's really all I can do here. I could create a group and that's it. There's no permissions options here at all. But I do need to make sure that this group does exist before we continue, so I'll create it. So we have this admins group, and just like both of my user accounts, it's completely useless because it serves no purpose whatsoever, at least not yet. We need to give it a purpose, and to do that, we'll click on permissions, and what I'll do is click add. I'll add a group permission. So what I'm going to do is just add / right here at the top. You can restrict the permissions down. As you can see here, we have different paths. Even VM IDs, if you want to restrict a permission to a specific virtual machine, that's pretty cool. You can restrict the permissions to storage. So for example, if you want that group to only be able to manage storage, you can limit it to just that. Just to keep it simple, I'm going to give it everything. In the real world, you wouldn't want to do this. You want to create a group for storage or virtual machines. Basically, just give people the least amount of permissions that they need to do their job. But I'm just using / right here because I just want to show you what that looks like. So I'll drop group down, and we have the admins group right here. And right now, the role is no access. So what I'm going to do is assign the role administrator to this group. And I'll click add. And let me show you what that actually means. So if I click on roles, we have administrator right here. Privileges tells us what this particular role is allowed to do. So administrator is allowed to do everything. No access is the default, which gives you, well, nothing, gives you no access. But we also have other permissions here that are fairly self-explanatory. So for example, we can even create a group that is able to manage users, but not manage virtual machines. So maybe you have a person at your company, if you do use Proxmox in a company, and their job is to create users when a new employee joins the company. You could give them access to do exactly that. But the user, if they were a member of a group that had this role, they would not be able to delete virtual machines or anything like that. And that's important. So this is what we're going with right now. So under groups, I created this group. And as you recall, there's no permissions here. There's nothing I can do. But I went up here to permissions. I added a permission, this one right here. It's applied to the admins group. And the admins group, in this case, is being given the role of administrator. Now the thing is, there's no user that's a member of this particular group. So what I'm going to do is click on users. I'll click on the PVE version of my user. We'll edit it. And we'll assign my user to the admins group. So now when I go to log out, I'm going to log in as that user. And I'll make sure I choose right here that I want to log into the Proxmox authentication server. I'll click login. And take a look at that. My user now has access to do pretty much everything. It didn't before, but it definitely does now. Now I'm going to log back in as root. Just wanted to make sure I showed you guys that. So let's go ahead and take another look at my PAM user here, because I mentioned that you should only use this for SSH. And that's true. Generally speaking, you want to use the PVE realm for anything that's PVE related. But what I'm going to do is delete the PVE user. And now we only have the PAM user here. I'm going to edit that PAM user, and I'm going to assign it to the group of admins. So what I'm going to do is log out, and let's log in as my user, but in this case, I want to log in as the PAM version of my user. And as you can see, my user is now able to do virtually everything. That's pretty cool. So let's go through a quick summary of how users works and just make sure that we have a well-rounded understanding. So I went over the two different realms. We have PAM and the Proxmox realm, as you see here. As I discussed earlier, PAM users are Linux users. Proxmox is a Linux distribution, so of course it has Linux users as an option. If I create a user here that's a PAM user, it is not created on the underlying Linux server. That means if you create a PAM user, you will not be able to log into the web console for Proxmox as that user, at least until you create that user on the underlying Linux system manually yourself. So once you create a PAM user on the Linux system, you can use the shell to do that, but basically you create a PAM user on the Linux system the same way you'd create a Linux user on any other system. Then after you do that, you add it to the Proxmox server as a PAM user. So creating a PAM user is done in two steps. You create it on the Linux system itself, and then you go into the web console for Proxmox and you create it there as well. A PVE user is created in a single step. You create it here in Proxmox itself, and you're done. PAM users, like I mentioned earlier, are mainly for people that are going to be using SSH. If that user won't be using SSH, then it's probably a better idea to create it as a PVE user. So as an administrator, it's pretty much up to you how you create your users. You could create everybody as a PAM user, which means you're going to have to execute basically 2 steps for every one user account that you want to create, or you could create everybody as a PVE user. Now, even though I have this PAM user, I'm still able to add it to a group. I added it to admins, and I can add that same group here to Spock as well. So even though PAM users and PVE users are 2 completely different types of users, they could both be used to manage the system. You just add them to the group. But by default, you don't actually have any groups. So what I did was I created admins right here. There's no options. This is just a place to create a group, and that's it. After you create a group, you can go here to permissions, and then you can add a permission for that group. So you can add a group permission or a user permission. So you can give a permission directly to a user if you want to. And it's pretty much the same thing, but I created a group permission, which resulted in this one right here. The path is /, which means this particular group applies to everything. And the role defines what members of that group are allowed to do. So the role applies to the path. That helps you define what each and every group is allowed to do. So what I'm going to do is create another group. I'll create user admin. So now we have that group. And then under permissions, I'm going to add a group permission for that group. I'll give it access to the entire server. I'll apply it to the new group that I created. And even though I'm giving it access to the entire server, I only want members of that group to be able to manage users. So I'll scroll down here. I'll select user admin, and then I'll click add. So now I can add a user to this particular group, user admin. And we created it here. And that'll give that particular user access to add and remove users to and from the system. So as you can see, you can define the permissions that users are able to do, assign those permissions to a group, and then assign that group to a user. Hopefully that makes better sense now. Now I recommend playing around with this. Just create some additional users, experiment with PVE and PAM users, and also experiment with permissions. Definitely add some permissions for your user, maybe create another one and add another group for that user as well. Just have some fun with this and explore it. And if you don't already understand it, I'm sure you will shortly. All right, so now you guys know how to manage users within Proxmox. And that's a very important skill for any administrator because managing users, that's something that we find ourselves doing quite a bit. But what's more important is the subject of backups and snapshots, which is going to be the subject of the next class in this series. And I should have that uploaded very soon if I don't already have it uploaded. And I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.